ممنون خانم شاملو. بسیار لذت بردیم و استفاده کردیم از سخنرانی و نکات بسیار ارزشمندی که با ما امروز به اشتراک گذاشتیم. سخنران بعدی ما خانم دکتر بازوبندی، خانم دکتر سارا بازوبندی هستند که پژوهشگر مؤسسه سیاست‌های امنیتی از دانشگاه کیل و همکار پژوهشی در مؤسسه آلمانی مطالعات جهانی و منطقه‌ای هستند. ایشون همچنین استاد مدعو در مؤسسه تحقیقات صلح و سیاست امنیتی دانشگاه هامبورگ باشند. ایشون در زمینه اقتصاد سیاسی آموزش دیدن و پروژه‌های مختلف مشاوری در بخش‌های دولتی، خصوصی در منطقه خاورمیانه و شمال آفریقا فعالیت داشتند. موضوع سخنرانی ایشون کاهش ریسک‌های اقتصادی و سیاسی در بازسازی ایرانه که تایتلش هم Mitigating Economic and Political Risks in Iran's Reconstruction. خانم دکتر بفرمایید.
Bear with me until I technologically set up myself. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great honor to be here this morning with you. I'm really glad that I find myself amongst like-minded colleagues, compatriots, and Iran lovers. And I really feel privileged to be a part of this conversation. I was invited about the question of risk and how risk is perceived, how hopefully I can offer some suggestions can be mitigated as well. Once an academic, always an academic. So bear with me because I want to start with a bit of theoretical framework to say when we talk about risk, what are the measures, what are the criteria that we look at from the perspective of risk analysts, especially those who are sitting outside of the country. And if I manage to de-glitch myself to go to my next slide, that would be a big achievement. Or maybe the tech team could change my slides or something. I don't know. Which one? Do I have to press the top one or the bottom one? Both? Do I need to point at this? No? So I carry on with what I had to say. Hopefully my slides will show up at some point. So you jumped once. Ah, perfect. Which one was it? The top one? Okay, yeah, thank you. When we talk about risk and risk analysis, of course, there is a whole host of factors that we take into consideration. For example, from the political perspective to economic to socioeconomic factors, government stability, socioeconomic conditions, investment profile, external conflict, internal conflict, corruption, of course, was mentioned by wonderful colleagues before me that one of the most important obstacles that any conversation about risk in Iran faces is the question of corruption. Military politics, and I think this is particularly important in the Iranian context because of the strength of business-military complex that exists and have been, in fact, expanded and consolidated over the recent decades. Religious tensions, law and order, ethnic tensions, democratic accountability, bureaucratic quality. So there is a whole host of factors that has to be kept into consideration. And of course, when we talk about a perspective of the investors from outside of the country, which I think one of the most key common themes of this morning amongst all the speakers was that there is definitely a genuine need for attracting foreign investors inside Iran. The question of democratic accountability and bureaucratic quality becomes very, very important. Now, the methodology that often is used by different organizations, international organizations or private business intelligence firms, like the ones that I often interact with, is a combination of qualitative and quantitative analysis. Quantitative analysis without context is just background noise, basically. So you cannot possibly just refer to numbers and graphs and percentages without really understanding the context. And I think more often than not, in risk analysis from outside of Iran, we face with neglecting the latter in the interest of showing the former a little bit glossier. In other words, often it happens, especially with international organizations, data productions, and so on and so forth, that the context is ever so slightly overlooked in order to highlight the success stories a little bit clearer. But I personally believe that it's very important to keep both qualitative and quantitative aspect of risk analysis in mind. Now, I want to share with you data that is produced by different organizations, data that looks at various indicators. Some of them are international rankings, some of them are score-based system. Just to show that where does Iran sit in the global map and most specifically in the regional map. And I very much agree with the previous colleagues that mentioned, especially Nader John, when she presented and compared, for example, Iran with Saudi Arabia and Turkey, and compare the countries that are playing in the same league, so to speak. And I try to highlight countries that are closer in ranking. For example, Legatum Institute Prosperity Index that looks at safety and security, personal freedom, governance, social capital, and so on and so forth, ranks Iran as 123rd in 2013 to 125 in 2022 and 126 in 2023. Now compare with even countries like Tajikistan, Cambodia, Nicaragua, or regional countries like Egypt. Iran is still significantly ranked below. Another example is Economic Freedom Index by Heritage Foundation. Again, as you can see, this is a score-based system, meaning each indicator is calculated based on quantitative methods, and final grade, so to speak, is given to each country. And if you compare Iran, for example, with similar-ish dynamics like Egypt or Saudi Arabia, you could see that Iran is still doing relatively worse than its peers and its regional peers and its global peers. The next ranking I would like to share with you is the World Bank Ease of Doing Business score. This is one of the most popular scores that we often talk about it, and as you can see, Iran ranks again significantly below some of the other regional countries, for example, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, even Tunisia, Russia, and so on and so forth. And the only regional peers that rank a little bit worse than Iran are countries like Lebanon, Sudan, and Iraq. Now, why these rankings are important, why, for example, ease of doing business is important, is in fact, these indicators are the first point of entry for any risk analysis by foreign firms. Of course, in recent years, most of the inquiries about risk analysis about Iran boils down to the question of sanctions, boils down to the question of individuals, designations of organizations, and of course the business-military complex that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. So these are the key sort of obstacles that really is on the way of attracting foreign investors, is on the way of normalizing Iran's position, in a sense, in the global economic system. Now, I have a list of sort of selected list of areas to look at on risk analysis on Iran, and I would like to, and unfortunately I'm so far the bearer of the bad news still, so but bear with me, it's going to get a little bit better and a little bit more hopeful. In terms of economic risk, the areas that we really need to focus on for risk mitigation purposes are the followings. And I highlighted these in red because I think these are almost all of these criteria, all of these factors really need specific attention. Stability and insolvency of the banking system. Iran's banking system is a socio-economic ticking bomb because of the lax regulations, lack of transparency, lack of independence of central bank, and of course the question of corruption. Short and medium term growth was mentioned, is also another factor that needs to be put on the list of important and urgent criteria. Debt and generally the health of government budget sheets and government balance sheets is quite important. The government monetary and currency stability. These days we hear with every sneeze that is heard in the White House, the currency and exchange rate in Iran increases quite dramatically. So the instability of foreign exchange market in Iran is indeed one of the significant challenges on the way of risk mitigation and attracting foreign investment in Iran. Access to affordable capital and, of course, the rule of law. Political risk, we are doing relatively better in my opinion, in compare with in the realm of economic indicators. We have some of these issues, like, for example, terrorism, violence and crime, or regulatory and policy environment, freedom of workforce, immigration and employment law. Of course, there is always room for improvement, but these are not the areas that are in compare even with some of the other regional countries, some of the neighboring countries, if you, for example, look at Iraq or Afghanistan or Turkey and so on, Iran is still doing well. And the reason that I highlight these areas that are not so critical and so dire is that in the spirit of remaining positive, I think it's important to know that what are the areas that we could have relatively hopeful sort of ending, relatively hopeful prospect to our conversation about risk and risk mitigation. And finally, it's the structural factors. We talked about the labor force, we talked about the demographic structure, physical infrastructure, social infrastructure, labor force, competitors. Of course, there is the question of sanctions, export regulations, military business complex, and these are the sort of areas that under structural reforms really need to be receiving attention. Now, I want to, so these were so far the not very positive news that, unfortunately, looking at the past decades of policy adoption in Iran, both domestically and internationally, have created an environment in which a lot of these indicators had to be highlighted in red. Now, I want to leave you with a few takeaway points, and I want to sort of end this with a relatively positive takeaway. The most important and the first takeaway point I would like to leave you with is that risk mitigation is not about creating a glossy cover for attracting foreign investors. Of course, that is an important issue, but risk mitigation has to be an all-encompassing and that is aimed at addressing internalized risk perceptions for individuals, entities, and states. So risk mitigation is not just about attracting foreign investors, is about creating an environment in which average Iranian citizens have a more stable prospect, a more hopeful future, and a more positive outlook towards the socioeconomic stability of the country. Therefore, all of these stories that I talked about and all of these indicators and all of these numbers and graphs and various methodologies really only make sense and can only make a real difference if there is a real difference in the livelihood of the average Iranian citizens. The second point is that risk mitigation and economic reform should not be just limited to an obsession about how can we reconnect with the global economy. In fact, it has to be focused on how can we use global economy to improve the socioeconomic environment for the average Iranian citizens. The reason for that is that the whole concept of globalization, the connectivity of various countries across global supply chain has proven that over time, inequality increased globally and the accumulation of wealth and economic opportunities in certain geographic zones have increased. So smart reform and smart risk mitigation is looking at what is the connection between all of these opportunities outside of the country with those who are living within the country and those who are affected by these policies. The third factor I would like to leave with you is, as it was rightly mentioned, Iran is not doing really well in attracting global talent. In fact, we have serious case of brain drain in Silicon Valley and beyond. The elements of it are quite visible. According to the government organizations inside Iran, the data shows that over the past 10 years, on average, 26,000 Iranians have left the country. Only in 2022, at the critical year, the sad year of the latest round of uprising in Iran, that number almost doubled. But I still do strongly believe that one of the most important backbones for the future of Iranian economy is its human capital. In compare with many countries across the region, Iran has well-educated, well-trained, motivated, hardworking population. And with the right policy choice, these human capital can be effective and can be utilized to address the existing risks and to facilitate the much needed economic reforms in the years to come. The fourth point I would like to leave you with is that the business military complex must be dismantled. No good comes out of a system in which the money, cash, and guns are in the same hand. Economic interest cannot be combined with securitization. Economic interest cannot be combined with defense strategy. There has to be a complete division of these two segments. What in my recent studies, and here I'm going to do a little bit of segue to just share one of my relatively recent studies, is that I looked at the question of knowledge-based economy in Iran. This has been the mantra of economic policy in recent years. Most of the senior political elite in Iran have talked about it. It has been implemented into policy in the forms of government perks, supports for knowledge-based economy and knowledge-based companies in Iran. But if you look at the number of these companies that are established in Iran and receive these government supports and government perks based on the field of their activities, you'd see that most of these investments, most of these companies are focused in industries that have dual use purposes: photonic, aviation, hard machinery, cyber and IT. And very little is done in areas that have direct impact on the livelihood of average Iranian citizens: food, agriculture, water security, pharmaceutical, medical sector, healthcare sector. They are by far dwarfed by the other sectors that are in fact working towards the longevity of the political establishment rather than really focusing on socio-economic development of the country. And I think that has to be seriously changed. And the final point I would like to leave you with is, another agent also sort of mentioned this, the question of where the global economy is headed. We need to accept that path dependency is a serious risk for every economy. So changing economic path and economic destiny is not an easy task. As it was also mentioned this morning, change is a process, is not a destination. It's a journey, is not the end goal. It is about gradually reforming and gradually taking various steps that can create an environment that the collective interest of every Iranian, whether living inside or outside of Iran, is protected. But we also need to be mindful of where is the global economy is headed. That's a part of my research these days is focused on looking at the question of artificial intelligence. It is expected to change our world. It is expected to create an environment that we really are uncertain. Even in the most developed economies in the world, there are a lot of uncertainties about the question of governance, about the question of impact on labor force. It was also mentioned this morning that some of our neighboring countries are really becoming front runners. They're establishing themselves, or at least let me put it this way, they're aiming to establish themselves as front runners and leading global powers in the field of artificial intelligence. The reason is that whilst we had due to corruption and prioritization of spending resources, we had different priorities in Iran. Our neighboring countries have managed to accumulate a vast amount of wealth. The largest sovereign wealth funds, commodity-based sovereign wealth funds in the world, are hosted, and based in our neighboring countries across the Persian Gulf. And these are the countries like United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, these are the countries that are really investing in owning and leading the newly established, newly formed, newly emerging global economic order, which is led by artificial intelligence. We need to be mindful of this reality. We need to be mindful of the competition that we have to prepare ourselves with. We need to be very selective about what we want to be when we grow up. We need to be very mindful and very careful about how can we position ourselves in this journey as we are working on economic reform and risk mitigation to be able to jump on this fast pacing train that has already set off from the first train station. Therefore, understanding the risk, both from internal and external perspective, understanding the environment in which we are operating and we're trying to prepare ourselves to mitigate the risks in that environment are quite crucial. Thank you so much for your patience. I went slightly over time. That's the danger of being a teacher. Once we start speaking, it's very hard to stop us from speaking. I would like to thank you and thank the organizers one more time for putting this great event together, and I'm looking forward to your questions and hopefully further collaborations.